Well, we can go ahead and get started.
All
It's time.
righty. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Virtual Breakfast on September 12th, 2024. My name is Teresa Crook, and I'm a field crops agronomist educator with Michigan State University, located here at the Saginaw Valley Research and Education Center. This morning, we have Dr. Molly Sears, Assistant Professor in the Department of Agriculture, Food, and Resource Economics at Michigan State, joining us. And without further ado, Dr. Sears will be presenting the key factors this morning influence the 2024 commodity prices over the next few months, both nationally and internationally, as well as when and how to consider locking in your commodity prices for this year. Good morning, Dr. Sears.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's just a real pleasure to be here with you all this morning. I'm going to be talking about a grain marketing outlook with a really excellent introduction by Teresa. I'm an assistant professor in the Ag, Food, and Resource Economics department here at MSU. And I also want to give a real thank you to Jonathan Laporte, an extension educator here at MSU, who is also excellent with respect to grain marketing and who I consulted with for this presentation. So I'd like to talk a little bit about where prices are at now, what we might be reasonably able to expect going forward, what kind of things are happening on the international market. And then, we have a brief 15 minutes or so here together, but transition into a little bit about what can we do with respect to the low price environment that we're sitting in. So I'll start by talking a little bit about corn. It's hard to talk about all of this. We've had a great year in the United States with respect to weather and crop yields, and the problem with having a great year with respect to weather and crop yields across a wide area means that prices are very low, and projections have continued to trend lower. And so I've got a graph on the screen here. I know a lot of folks aren't looking at the PowerPoint, but essentially what we see with the corn prices is no surprise, right? We had kind of a low price environment around or below $4 a bushel between 2014 and early 2020, and then had the massive spike in corn prices up to over $7 a bushel. Projections suggest that we're really headed back towards $4 a bushel territory. So when we look at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange futures contracts, they've fallen consistently throughout the year. As of 2 days ago, it was at $4.04 a bushel. So this is all very consistent with the belief that overall yields in the US are going to be above trend. There haven't been any significant market surprises. Both from an international context and from a US context, it's been a fairly good supply and stable demand with lower prices. I will say that yields have been lower in the EU, in Argentina. They've been projected to be a little bit lower in Ukraine and Russia, but their planting acres had increased over the year. So we expect overall global supply to be a little bit diminished. But in the US, supplies are increasing and stable. And here's just a figure that kind of shows that stability and in yield and increases over time. Really, if yields come out to what they are projected to be, which is right at about 183 bushels per acre across the whole of the US, that would be a record-setting yield nationally. And so supply in response to 183 bushel per acre yield is also going to be close to an all-time high, right around 17,000 million bushels. So a huge amount of yield. So with that current futures price, we kind of look towards that December Chicago Mercantile Exchange futures price. It's essentially saying that they expect cash prices to be below $4 at harvest. So somewhere probably around $3.80 a bushel. What that means, however, is that cash prices are going to change throughout the course of the growing season, right? And throughout the course of the marketing year. And so right at harvest, that's going to probably be about the lowest price that you'd expect. And so with typical trends, across the marketing year, we would expect cash prices to increase over that season. So probably an average of right around $4 a bushel for 2024 production makes sense given the current forecast. And you can get a sense of this by looking at the December 2025 futures prices as well. And those are trading right around $4.43 a bushel, suggesting that cash prices at harvest in 2025 could be in the low $4.30 range. Of course, the challenge with this, and as we get closer to these dates, these values get more and more established. But when you kind of look back at different forecasts and outlooks over the last several months, those numbers have been kind of consistently ticking down by a few cents a bushel, essentially every month. Soybeans are a really similar story here. November futures prices. So the marketing year for soybeans starts in November, and those futures prices are trading right around $9.98 a bushel. And so the cash price at harvest falling below $10 a bushel is very likely, given the current futures prices. But the expectations would be that the overall market year average prices might be around $10.50. And then in 2025, that market year average price of $10.80. We really see a similar picture with respect to the overall change in prices over the last decade. Right between 2014 and 2019, we really saw soybean prices right around $9 a bushel. And then in 2020 through 2023, we saw that pretty high price environment. It's been ticking down a little bit over the last few years, but up to $13, $14 a bushel, and kind of slowly, well, depending on your definition of slowly, dropping down by about $1, $1.50 a bushel. And compared to corn, which experienced really those hot temperatures in July, kind of especially in the EU, soybeans globally, their projections for yields globally has been pretty high. So expecting kind of a record year internationally. Low yields in Argentina, but generally high yields in India, high yields across the rest of the globe. Wheat is also on a decline. This is a terrible talk to give, terrible news to give at 7 o'clock in the morning. But prices for all U.S. wheat classes have also declined, given the expectations for a record year in wheat yields. One of the interesting things that I think has happened over the last year or so is that the spread between different classes has narrowed. There was a really big discount, especially for soft red winter wheat in 2022 and 2023. But then because it was so discounted, a lot of it got used in food production. And so that discount has narrowed. But overall, those prices are trending downward. I've put a very similar graph for wheat compared to corn and soybeans, but just wanted to split things out across hard red winter, hard red spring, and soft red winter wheat. The spikes for wheat were also big in 2021 and through 2023, kind of raising up all the way, during the peak of kind of the Ukraine war conflict. I'm not saying it's over, but up to $14 a bushel in this case. And so really watching the wheat market over the last several months has been kind of jarring. There was a 4-year low projected in wheat prices right at the end of August. To my knowledge, that's when we kind of saw that yields and plantings in Ukraine and Russia were quite high and that the yields were projected to be good. But the market has since softened a little bit as we've gotten a bit more worried about whether or not they were going to make it to market. September 2024 contracts have been priced at around $5.57 a bushel, and July 2025 contracts are about $6.09 a bushel. Again, I pulled all these numbers Tuesday afternoon, and so take it with a grain of salt. But really, these prices are going to look very comparable to 2018, 2019, and 2020, 2021 market year average prices. Of course, one of the challenges with this particular set of prices in this environment is that input prices, while they've declined over the last few years, they still remain quite high in comparison to that 2014 through 2019 period where our marketing prices look similar. So margins are going to be thin to non-existent. But I do want to talk a little bit about historic pricing patterns over the course of the growing season, where we might want to see ourselves fitting in, what kinds of projections can we make about making the best kind of marketing decisions for you over the course of the year. And so the marketing seasons, again, for grain commodities, I've been giving the futures contracts for kind of that start of the marketing season. So we're thinking about December through September for corn, November through September for soybeans, and September through July for wheat. And why is this important? Well, typically we think about kind of the historic pricing patterns as a little bit of a curve where prices are going to be especially low towards that beginning of the marketing season. It's after harvest, you know how much supply there is, there's a lot available, and then those prices are going to slowly increase kind of over the course of the marketing season, and then again kind of start to fall as we get close to the next harvest. And so we want to think about kind of trying to time our marketing as such that we're kind of hitting those peak prices. Of course, that comes with a lot of complications. A lot of that is associated with things like storage costs and what your local basis is. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in the time we have remaining. But it is important to kind of say, well, look, these futures contracts have pretty poor prices. But if we think about over the course of the marketing season, we might be able to increase our returns a little bit. However, I will say that this is kind of a really, I gave kind of a simplistic example of this soybean marketing year pricing curve over time. And when we look at what's actually happening to cash prices for different commodities, we may not see that perfect curve over the course of the marketing season. So I'm showing a figure here that's essentially the yellow corn cash prices in central Illinois over the last 4 years. And I'd say really only 2021 and 2022 are showing kind of that classic increase in prices over the course of the marketing season and then decreasing again towards harvest. The other years have remained a little bit flat, so to speak. And 2020, 2021 may not be the case. Anyway, the point is that these curves are kind of a theoretical example of what we might expect to be happening with respect to prices over the marketing year. Right now, our expectations are such that there haven't been any sort of major shifts in policy such that we could expect a relatively stable curve in this space. But I will say this isn't always the case. Okay. So with the last couple of minutes, I want to talk a little bit about how we respond. And so one of the kind of classic examples for grain marketing is to think about what's happening in your projections, so your personal beliefs about what's going to happen to the futures market compared to what's happening locally with the basis. And that basis is that difference between what you're paying at your local grain elevator compared to those futures contracts. And so there's kind of a two-axis diagram here. If you think futures are going to go up or futures are going to go down and basis is weakening or it's getting stronger, and that kind of puts you in a particular quadrant. So I'll give you a quick example of what might be happening based off of what I'd kind of see in soybeans. So let's think of a quick example for soybeans where it looks like I've got kind of futures over the course of the calendar year here for soybeans. And while futures in general have gone down, kind of over the course of January through August, it looks like futures are kind of increasing a little bit through September. So maybe we think futures are going to increase a little bit. Basis, we want to think about strong or weak basis depending on that relationship to the markets. So strong basis is where the difference between the cash and the futures value is small or narrow, meaning you really want to get the crop to the market now. Weak basis is when the difference between the cash and the futures market is very large or very wide. And so the best way I think to check the basis is to use the Purdue Center for Commercial Agriculture Crop Basis tool, which covers Michigan. So here's an example that I pulled again on Tuesday of nearby corn basis for South Central Michigan. And it's a little tricky because kind of that we just started going over to December futures, so we don't have a lot of data points there. But essentially what you can see is if you that there is a huge basis. So this is a very, very weak basis. This means that the difference between that cash price and the futures market price is massive, which suggests that you probably don't want to sell your crops on the cash market right now. But you can kind of select this, your county and the commodity that you're looking at to get a better sense of what the basis is. So let's say, for example, that we're thinking about the basis weakening and future prices are up. So say we expect that basis to continue to decline and futures prices are going up. There are several things that you can do. You could engage in a basis contract. You could sell cash for grain and buy futures. You could sell cash and buy a call. You could forward contract and buy a call. You could engage in a minimum price contract. These are the kinds of expectations that you might have if you think that basis is going to continue to get worse over time. You might want to consider to engage with the cash market now and buy futures to kind of help hedge your position going forward. So this is, I'm not saying that basis is necessarily weakening. This completely depends on your area. This is kind of a personal belief of how you think things are going in the market, and this changes from week to week. But this is the kind of thinking process that you might want to go through if you're looking at these particular examples. So if you think that that is going to continue to widen, you want to lock in your basis now, wait on futures, and the decision tools are going to capture that favorable basis, exit cash, set a price floor, and offer a chance to buy if price continues upwards. But what I can pitch in my last minute here is that there's a lot of really excellent MSU extension resources on these topics that go through all of those different quadrants, depending on whether basis is widening or narrowing, of futures prices are going up or down, and kind of the individual steps that you can take to walk through all of these green marketing situations. Don't let the beginning farmer demand series kind of wrap you in if you're an experienced farmer. These are just really nicely designed tools. I'm not an author. This is no self-promotion here, but that walk through all of these grain marketing pieces. And with that, I'm going to cede my time, and I will look forward to being able to answer questions later as we go forward. Thanks.
So before I start taking questions, I'm going to let you know that I did put the information that Dr. Sears had talked about for the chat. I did put the Purdue link in there, and I also put the link for the demand series. So if you had those, had some questions, feel free to use those links. Before I forget of anything else, I'm going to go to other questions. Lyndon Kelly said that he's on the road, so he couldn't put this information in, but he asked me to share the following, that fall irrigation resources are available, and I'll put those in the chat too. He said near drought conditions are in many areas of southern Michigan, and they may challenge the irrigation to use challenge irrigators to use water effectively and to secure grain quality and maximize their cover crop investment if they're putting cover crops on. So I did put one of the first articles in there about watering up your cover crops, and I'm going to be going ahead and sending out the second one that is the timing for the last irrigation.
I put that in for you, Teresa.
Oh, thank you. Also, Phil did put the information in for the RUP credits in there too. And then I will go ahead and start looking at some of the questions that are in the chat. And then there are some other ones that come up that I'll ask for some additional educators if they have any comments. So the first one is from Mr. Byrne that says, what is the average cost per acre for inputs for corn and soybeans? And how long can farms hang on with low prices? And that would be a Dr. Sears question.
Hi, John. I put a little bit of information in the chat, but that's the real question here. Right now, I mean, if you think about getting 200 bushels per acre of corn, you'd be sitting at about $800 in revenue, in gross revenue. But if we think about all of our input costs, our power costs, and our overhead costs, I'm seeing estimates that are right around $750, and that's before cash rent. And so right now, a lot of the projections for corn production are negative when you include land related costs. The same is true for soybeans, but we're getting a lot closer to zero at least. But frankly, the situation looks pretty dire, especially for those who are not owning the land directly.
Right. And I think that one of the gentlemen that responded to the first question was that it's going to be a pretty tough year and pretty challenging to break even. So he's kind of echoing your thoughts.
Absolutely. It's more about like minimizing losses, I think, rather than looking for heavy profits this year.
Right. Are there any other educators or specialists that would want to make any comments this year or this morning? I don't know if Chris or if Marty's on this morning.
Nothing from me.
Thank you.
Same here, Teresa. Nothing new.
Okay. I didn't know if Marty, if you wanted to talk about of tar spot. I know they can't do anything about it, but I think as far as the amount that's in the countryside, did you want to make comments along those lines or?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things is that the amount of pressure is variable across the state. I was down in Southwest Michigan just the other day, and there's very little pressure down there. There's also a lot of brown lawns, so that sort of indicates, lack of moisture that they've had down there. Up in the Thumb area, Phil Cates is telling me about some areas where there's some pretty strong pressure and some pretty big differences between sprayed and non-sprayed checks. So it's variable. I think the important thing is to be out, check for lodging if we do have heavy tar spot or other foliar diseases that can result in lodging. So just being aware of that. So I think that's the main thing. And then also rapid dry down of corn silage. So really paying attention if you have silage that you don't lose too much moisture before chopping.
All right. Thanks, Marty.
Thank you.
If there's nobody else, I was going to put just a quick little information out there. The soybean harvest equipment field day is going to be September 26th down in Lenawee County. And I put the link for registration in the chat if you're interested in attending that. We look forward to seeing you down there. All right. So one more question that came up is how do the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China grouping, South Africa, how those countries, and I know there's additional ones that were added this year, impact the global and US markets? And how do we predict the supply and the pricing that they have on us and our markets?
Yeah, I think this is a really fair question. There's a couple of things that I'll say to that. The first is that when you track a lot of the kind of international export prices over time, the US has been very closely following with international export prices for some of the BRIC nations. So in that case, things are looking okay. It looks like the export prices are sitting closer to $4.80 a bushel, which would make the US very competitive with that. As for the BRIC nations in particular, we've seen India change their biofuels policy this year, which is going to increase both their corn imports, but probably as well just their planted corn acres. We're also seeing they're increasing their soybeans planted as well. And soy in general has increased kind of in plantings across all BRIC nations is in general, with decent yields. As far as Russia goes, and I'm going to lump Ukraine in this as well, just I think that's kind of our hardest area to predict right now. The planted acres have really increased, especially with respect to wheat, but also for soybeans. I think for Ukraine especially, it's going to be a little bit of a challenge to see what gets to market, although their yields are pretty good, even with a warm July. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest question marks that we have here is like what is going to be able to make it to the export market from that region. But right now, the projections, the WASI reports, everything is estimating that things will proceed somewhat normally. But I think that's probably something to keep close tabs on that could provide some opportunities for marketing gains if things don't go according to plan in that space. Thanks.
Got it. Thanks. The second question was, and this could be actually you or Dr. Andreessen, do you anticipate any weather factors impacting our prices significantly? Like if we have an active hurricane season, will it impact, getting the crops harvested or the level of the Mississippi as far as barge traffic or anything like that?
I'll let Jeff speak on this as well, but of course that's kind of always a factor here, right? All of the numbers that I'm projecting are assuming kind of consistency on the way out, and it's those big kind of I won't say black swan events because it's weather, but it's those big events that can lead to those market shocks. And so if you end up in a situation where weather is only impacting a small area locally, but has a really big impact, that is really unfortunate for them and unlikely to have a big impact on overall market prices. But if you happen to have decent yields in a space where big weather impacts or big shocks occur, then you're put at a bit more of an advantage. As of right now, there's no forecast for really extreme events happening, but I'll leave that to Jeff to talk about maybe probabilities of those occurring.
And follow, I would agree. Right now, well, as you heard from the forecast, at least for much of the Corn Belt, we're looking at really pretty favorable conditions for this time of the year, at least for the harvest and fall field work type of activities. And there isn't anything on the horizon, at least at this point, closer to home. I would also say, interestingly, and Molly talked about this earlier, but globally, if we do indeed move into a La Nina condition here later on for the fall and into next year, that there is some correlation with lower than average crop yields, both for corn and soybeans globally. It's not huge, but there is a correlation there. It's something just to keep in the back of your mind, but something that, and that of course that would be in production areas, South America, et cetera, that we would see some impacts possibly there. And that doesn't happen that way all the time, but there is some correlation with that. And it sounds like in our current markets that maybe anything that would not indicate a larger crop would be a positive, but that is one so something to keep an eye on.
Great, thank you. Phil had a question, and it is, what kind of price advantage can on-farm storage provide for farmers versus selling at harvest?
That's a great question, Phil. On-farm storage can really provide some advantages with respect to just providing increased flexibility. Of course, we have to weigh all of those different pieces here, right? So the first is that we need to think about the cost of building on-farm storage compared to the cost of paying someone else to store your grain for you, and potentially what kind of value you have and being able to hold on to that grain and sell it later. Obviously, what I was talking about before was trying to think about, well, can we rely on those normal pricing patterns, right? Where we think about trying to sell our soybeans somewhere in the June, July, August range, kind of at that traditional peak pricing situation. But of course, you need to be able to store your soybeans through that spot. So it's a common option across producers. I think it's a very solid option, but the challenge is, of course, it doesn't offer like true risk protection compared to some of the other kind of futures market, spot contracts and things like that, because what happens if pricing patterns aren't normal, like we've seen, especially with corn, then you're paying to store your grain and then you don't get those kind of pricing advantages. However, it is common for a reason, and that is because we frequently see those pricing patterns. We just have to weigh kind of the costs of implementing a storage system versus paying someone else to do it versus the selling right at harvest. But given current direct market prices, selling right at harvest sounds like a pretty tough way to go in the current state of things.
Got it. Thank you. Going back, just more of a reiteration of what Marty said. The other one, there was a comment from Mr. Briggs. Tar spot is in Mason County. Have some fungicide strip trials. Results will be interesting. Noticing quite a difference in hybrid tolerance. Encourage other farmers experience some tar spot to scout their fields and for possible hybrid tolerance differences. Okay, we seem to be jumping around, so we're going to go back to pricing now again and economics. So what effects could we expect on other agriculture economics, such as cattle or forage with the relatively lower grain prices?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a challenge to think of like general equilibrium effects with respect to all of these moving pieces here. But with lower grain prices, we expect input prices to be lower. For other kinds of commodities, we would expect input prices for cattle to reduce, which could provide some advantages to cattle producers with respect to overall profitability. But of course, over time, those profits would get kind of soaked up by the market. With respect to forage, I suppose we could expect forage to be a little bit less valuable on the market with respect to reduced overall grain prices. So certainly, I think the bigger point here is that all of these shocks to the market have kind of continual effects, right? There is some maybe hope from the consumer perspective that lower wheat prices might result in lower food prices. But again, there's just so many like hands that these processes touch before it reaches a end market, whether that be in cattle or whether it be on your grocery store shelves, that it's hard to predict exactly how much of a swing that might have. But we would expect some minor shifts to occur in all these spaces.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat, Phil. So unless you have any additional things, I would thank everyone for participating in our virtual breakfast today. And keep in mind that you can find the recording for this in Spotify or an Apple Podcast, or you can follow us on Facebook for not only this morning's presentation, but for other ones for this year and previous years. I wish everyone a safe and prosperous harvest this season, and thank you again for attending this morning. Have a great day. Ciao.